Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Spatz, and I have the pleasure of being the chair of the Industrial Advisory Committee. And 14 months ago, when we first convened as a committee, I quite frankly could not have imagined that we would have accomplished so much. At the same time, 14 months ago, there's no way that I would have imagined that we would be competing this evening with the Mets playing in the World Series. But both have become a reality, which I'm very pleased to say. First and foremost this evening, I want to thank the Board of Trustees, our village manager, village planner, for this collective effort and assistance in applying originally for the grant, the RFP, and arranging the interview process for various consultants, which ultimately led us to our consultants, Replace Urban Studio, as well as providing the technical support with previous presentations and workshops we've held with the village. I would also be remiss if I failed to thank the members of the Industrial Advisory Committee, having worked tirelessly to arrive at proposals and visions that you will hear this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor to embark upon this task with this group. When we embarked upon this endeavor, we set upon one of many priorities: to seek economic, environmental longevity here in the industrial area and raising the bar for the Sound Shore as well as the county alike. Looking at an empty canvas, learning from the success and challenges of prior studies, we wanted to arrive at a final comprehensive product that could be used in the future as a tool to guide and inspire economic growth and development, yet celebrate the historic context of the area and remain consistent in harmony with the character of our community. It was paramount for the committee to remain steadfast to the notion of welcoming all suggestions, ideas, and visions, which included indoor sports facilities, soccer, lacrosse, which you'll see up on some of the screens, basketball, art galleries, business incubators, restaurants, gourmet grocery stores, work-stay facilities, weekend open markets and food truck fairs, and even a boutique hotel. Yet we always kept in mind the need to preserve the uses which are currently enjoyed here in the industrial area, to provide, which includes providing good employment, products which are made here in the village of Mamaroneck, in places that some of us still call home. It was equally as important to remain accessible, to address the concerns that the residents, property owners, and business owners had alike. Finally, it was our mission, upon arriving at a final vision, we would seek the support of the Village Board of Trustees. Not just seeking the support, but allowing them to facilitate and implement the recommendations. It's one thing to actually come up with a proposal, but we must remain steadfast in having the visions implemented and having the support to do so. Now this turns us now to Replace Urban Studio. How did we come across Urban Replace Studio? Straight out of the gates, Peter Syrett and his team provided a fresh philosophical approach to the proposed study based on statistics, economics, social, cultural, and environmental factors. Replace has also remained steadfast in their commitment to ascertain the unique needs and challenges to this community through dialogue and outreach directly with the community, and share our goal to maintain a transparent, collective, and participatory study. Over the last 9 months, in conjunction with Replace Urban Studio, numerous meetings have been held with the Industrial Advisory Committee, village officials, chairs and members of the Mamaroneck Village Land Use Commissions and Boards, and as equally important, outreach has been made through these meetings and workshops with property owners here in the industrial area and residents in Washingtonville. These meetings have always provided a plethora of ideas, models, and successful examples for communities much similar to ours. But Replace always kept in mind the clear distinction between a ground vision versus market reality, which would support these final proposals. Moreover, as these meetings progressed, it was clear that the vision wasn't just micro in nature, meaning just affecting us here in the industrial area or the village of Mamaroneck, but macro in nature, benefiting our neighbors, town of Mamaroneck, village of Larchmont, Harrison, and Rye. Since our first meeting with Peter and his team, in addition to identifying the needs of the industrial area, we've also been able to identify who may be a stakeholder in this endeavor. And the answer may surprise you. It's everyone. Everybody sitting in this room tonight, anybody who will be watching this presentation in the future, whether you live in the Heights, whether you work in the industrial area, whether you live in a community next door, or if you're a trustee, everybody is a stakeholder in this study. And with this presentation, and with this study, we embark upon a future that assures economic and environmental longevity. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our consultants. Thank you very much.
So I'd also like to thank Andrew for a very gracious introduction, and thank the committee members and everyone for their participation, because it's really a collective vision of the future of the industrial area, and what we just help is facilitate it and pull it together. And so I'd like to just begin with the comprehensive plan, which is sort of the foundation that we looked at as consultants about some of the key issues that have been laid out before. And you guys touched on that. You want to promote new uses. You want to do with traffic and parking. There's some zoning challenges, and as Andrew pointed out, flooding as well. So we not only worked with the outreach and doing analysis, we always kept in mind also the larger mission and goal set of the village's planning efforts to reach a certain set of goals. These slides, just for reference, could be accessible, so you can download this later if you have problems. Maybe we can dim the lights a bit.
Actually, excuse me 1 second. I've been only working on this one. Actually, I know which one we have to do.
One thing that Andrew covered so much in his opening, but one thing he did mention is that the industrial area is a long-standing part of the region and the village's economy.
If everybody can come in and have a seat, we still have some more chairs up front, and we're trying to bring this to one side.
Okay, you guys can stay in the back and heckle from there. So as we were saying, there's a long-standing history in the district itself of being an economic and industrial center, a healthy one, going back over 100 years. And as you can see from historic photographs, the nature of the industry has shifted over time. You can see this is on slide number 5. You can see a flower and feed grain shop. I don't think any of those exist today, to my knowledge, in the district. But really the question is, what is the future uses? What is the future industry? If this is the past, what is the future of the district? What is the vision of the district that will be healthy and continue to be this economic engine, as well as maybe even more for the village? One thing that's important to note is that we looked at, as part of our process, we looked at peer communities and peer industrial areas. So the purple, it looks like blotches on this map, are actually other industrial areas. And we looked at a handful of them to benchmark and understand really the performance today in real terms of the industrial areas, so that we can learn from that, grow from that, support what's good, and find new paths to optimize. And so one thing you see, if you look at Fort Chester, New Rochelle, Yonkers, and Mamaroneck is at the bottom, should be at the top. That's the bottom. On slide number 7, is you can see that in terms of the breakdown of jobs in the district, there's kind of a parity there. There's sort of the same amount of healthcare, very little healthcare, but of educational services, of retail trade, of public administration, and mostly the gray bar is mostly the industrial stuff. So right now it's performing, okay, thank you, it's performing as a peer to its other districts. But again, how do we move it up so it continues to do that and transcends it? One thing to look at a particular metric is to look at average square foot cost, and you can see it runs around $15 in the district. There's a, much like Watergate, there's a missing 18 minutes or so of tape of that here. But we can see that it's been fairly consistent across the last few years in the district, despite some of the real estate upturns and that. So that's good. And one of the reasons that is there's a very low vacancy rate, about 5%. And there's over around the industrial space, there's around 590,000 square feet of it. So very low vacancy. There are a lot of available leases. I'll explain the difference of that in a second. But a relatively low vacancy rate in the district. So again, the space is there. What we can see here is the vacancy rate. Again, there's the bottom one is Portchester. We think those numbers are skewed data-wise. So if you look at the purple line, which is Yonkers, and the yellow line, which is New Rochelle, you can see we're, again, performing sort of at a peer level to the other industrial districts. I keep on turning my pages, but the slides aren't changing. So we can, one thing we can say here is what I'm saying, there's been some real estate action. So the color coded is the different changes in the area. So there's sales and there's properties for lease, and there's been some sales. It's not particularly active, hot, but things are happening in the district. Oops. When we look at that, we can sort of see that a variety of properties of all different types are going, their square foot rent prices all average around $15. Some are higher, some are lower. The sizes range up to 40,000 plus square feet. So there are spaces available. How do we get the next generation of industry and smart occupants in there that'll help the village is the question. So one of the first things, and this goes back to what Andrew's saying about uses, the purple area in the center of slide 12 is the industrial area. Purple is the color coding for industry. So it's a sort of an island of industry. The yellow is housing, and the red is sort of commercial corridors. And so you can see, as you guys well know, the industrial area is sort of unto itself, sits separated. It's physically separated by rail lines and highways from the rest, but it's really isolated also in terms of permissible uses and what can occur there based on zoning. It has its own set of rules. In particular, it has a manufacturing overlay, and it really only allows commercial uses along Fenimore, and that's that dark kind of black box that we see on slide 13. Whoops, sorry. Within the district, so that it's manufacturing, but there's a great difference of uses. And we have some uses that aren't manufacturing. For example, there are about 50,000 square feet of residential use still in the district right now, 17 to 21 properties. I can't remember the exact number. But there's commercial that's gone off there. There's definitely industry, and there's some other uses. For example, there's even sports and recreation. There's a racquetball club, as you guys well know. So there's a little variety occurring there. One of the main drivers of why this place is where it is in terms of industrial centers, it sits along the corridor, the I-95 corridor, and there's an exit coming from the traffic going north right into the district. It's also along the Metro North Rail line, as you well know, which allows easy access there, and it's also a freight spur. So in the evenings, late at night, deliveries can even occur within the district. So it's well connected in terms of transit infrastructure.
You know, I'm just going to interject one thing. You hit it right on the point that it's a gateway. It's one of the major gateways to both the village, town of Mamaroneck, as well as Larchmont.
Yeah.
So in terms also of taking 2 steps back, where that retail was, that's only within 50 feet, I believe, of Fenimore Road,
Yes.
where you have many, many acres that would tremendously be enhanced by the ability to have retail.
Yeah. So, and I think it's an important thing. Eric is going to go, Eric, my colleague here, is going to go into great depth about this gateway idea, but it is a first impression. It's a doorway into the village if you're coming off the highway or if you're coming from down Fenimore. And so, good point. So traffic, one of the interesting things is because the traffic in terms of trucks, which is a big issue, is really controlled by, and this is a constraint I just want to point out to everyone because it's a big, big driver, bridge height and traffic lane, right? So like getting under certain bridges, and what it tends to do in aggregate is drive the traffic out to Mamaroneck Avenue down Hoyt. And that's
just the physics. You can't take a big truck across a small bridge or put a big truck underneath the railroad pass. And so that's what's sort of happening there. Another physical driver that's important, as Andrew pointed out, I'm going to be a glass half full kind of guy. 43% of the district is not in the flood zone. The remainder is in the flood zone. And that obviously presents both challenges in terms of future planning and towards the current usage and the infrastructure that's served there. And Eric, again, will identify opportunities in the planning to address that and how we're taking that on. The character of the district is important too. You guys well know it. It's a hodgepodge of buildings that range. Some are quite old plastic factories, and some quite historic structures to some very new structures. One of the defining characteristics of the district is actually that a lot of space is put over to parking. And I know this is one of the big challenges, but we want to kind of point this out as a paradox, that 51% of the district by area is dedicated to car storage or to parking. So that's its I would say it's one of its primary uses today. One of the other interesting things is to look at the district in terms of how much of it's been developed. And we use a metric called FAR, that's floor area ratio, and that basically how much is left over to be developed. And the purple is showing here that there is a significant amount of area. Right now the district overall has about 1.2 million square feet of built area, but it has right now under the current zoning over 700,000 square feet that could be built there. So in no way, shape, or form is a district kind of maxed out, and there's a lot of opportunity, even within the existing rules, to develop and to put more there. So I've touched on a lot of this. Great regional location. Cars are half the district storage area. The building stock is mostly around the 1960s. The floodplain issue. There's some great historic resources there that should be celebrated. Land use is a real mix. There's a multitude of parcels for lease right now, and as we said, there's a lot of area to be developed if you wish to do that. Another important thing is to look at the economics. We did a detailed study. I'll just touch on the highlights here. And one of the highlights is where are there opportunities? So we're sort of supply and demand study done, saying, okay, what are the industries looking for space? What businesses need space? And sort of the winners, the top ones that came out there, food sector. This is a direct result of New York City's real estate economy. So a lot of industry like bakers, for example, can't afford the pricing, let's say in the Bronx, to do an industrial bakery. They're looking for space. So $15 a square foot to them compared to the 23 or so in the Bronx seems like a bargain. So what we're seeing is a migration moving northwards on that. Landscaping is actually, by jobs, the dominant industry in the district today, and there's a great demand for more landscaping, just on a pure economic metric. Entertainment and recreation, that's another huge demand. There's a great need for that. We'll go in more detail about how that's going to be addressed in the plan, but that proves out as a very viable potential district anchor industry.
Which is important in context. Years past, individuals have wanted to come into the community to invest in that very concept, but because of the type of zoning encountered challenges, we are taking that on head on.
Yeah. And another industry, and I think this is those of you who have ever tried to rent an office in New York City will know that small office space, what is called Class C, is sort of startup incubator space. There's a huge demand. New York City has ever shrinking amount of Class C office space because it's getting converted to what? Residential. And so there is a great demand for that in the city and consequently in the areas that surround that. So office is another thing that sort of vets out as a flexible kind of incubator space. The economics of that sort of work out. Key challenges is sort of how do you kind of activate the district in terms of retail? Some of the lease issues in terms of the particular parcels are a challenge. And we're going to give more detail to people who want to dive into that. And sort of some of the high rent, you have low rent compared to let's say parts of New York City, but you have high rent compared to some of your peers. So that may be a challenge for some of the food industry. So Portchester, for example, you may be able to find a lower rent, or Yonkers or something like that. Even though there's great parity there's still opportunities for people to find a better rental thing. So having a strategy that works for that in terms of recruitment and retention would be good. You guys have location. So you need the location, location, location real estate, right? Infrastructure, not to be thing we didn't, our civil engineer level, our civil engineer looked at the infrastructure and the highlights of that. Main flooding, and this is not news to anyone in this room, I'm sure, is actually, though hurricanes are a major cause of flooding, it's major rain events are actually historically, if you go back through the data, that cause a local flooding. For example, at Hoyt and Fenimore, that low-lying dip to get underneath the bridge, that's primary floods due to rain. One of your electrical net service stations is in the flood zone. Ideally, you wouldn't want that, electricity, water. But the most interesting thing that came out of this is that right through Mamaroneck is a high-speed fiber internet connection, sort of like a trunk line that goes up kind of parallel to I-95. This gives a great speed, and this is a technological advantage that the district should capitalize on as an area. It's a great thing. I would promote it, advertise it, and celebrate it, because it's a great resource, particularly for attracting industries that are reliant or dependent on high-speed internet access. We also did a lot of research. We met, as Andrew said, in this very room. We had multiple outreach meetings. We had a website where people could send their comments. And what kind of came out of this are these 4 big ideas that sort of came out that helped guide it. Make the district a destination, a gateway. This is an idea that we heard from multiple stakeholders. Support and strengthen the local economic base. This is something Andrew emphasized, but it's really important. The business is there, the people are there, it's important. So none of this is about taking away, it's about augmenting and adding. Reconnect the district to the surrounding village and to the natural capital. Historically, it's turned its back on the river. The river, though it floods, is a resource. It's hard to walk from the district or to get to the district intentionally because it was separated because of historic reasons to separate uses for industry, but those no longer exist. So reconnect that and really celebrate the past and some of the great things that happened there. So there's main ideas. We had one other that got kind of struck out. That was this idea of separating people from vehicles, and in the end that kind of fell by the wayside. One of the things that came out of the outreach process, and there's a long list, and you can see this on slide 27, and I'll share, it's just a great wealth and a great variety of uses that range from retail to commercial. Even some, how do we deal with the residential that exists or without, and how do we manage that without driving this to a residential conversion project? Civic uses, park, recreational type of uses. And these all kind of came out of the process. And you'll see, again, when Eric presents the plan later in a little bit, like how we address each of those uses that came forward. We also really identified some of the challenges and opportunities that exercise came out. The challenges Andrew eloquently summarized, like the traffic, parking, and flooding, but some of the opportunities came out. This is a real opportunity, this plan to improve the quality of life in the village. It's an opportunity to reconnect the village, as we said. It's an opportunity to create recreational walks, opportunity to make a new business focus, let's say on a technology industry. So it's an opportunity, as more opportunities, I would say, rich in opportunities, and we can make the challenges work with it. One of the part of the process, and I just wanted to explain this, we spent a lot of time talking about precedents and benchmarking. So we benchmark economic data for, let's say, and environmental data for how the district was. But we also wanted to show and work with the committee and in the outreach process of other examples how industrial districts or communities throughout had faced several challenges similar. So I'm just going to take you briefly through these because these inform, and you'll again see when Eric does the plan presentation of it, you'll see these ideas reoccurring. Idea, the top one is sort of connection to nature and a connection to the river. And the river can be there and it can be a part of your park and recreational system. Even if it's a former industrial river like the Gowanus is the upper left corner here on slide 29. Turning the district into a 24-hour destination. So maybe it has a set of uses like maybe restaurant or entertainment that happens at night in and around the industrial uses that happen during the day. And that's taking advantage of the clock. So at nighttime, the district tends to empty out, but maybe there could be a couple of businesses that could exist in there that would be sympathetic and wouldn't put undue stress, let's say, on parking and things like that that are more geared for the evenings or weekends or other times like that.
Just want to interject on the top part. If you get off 95 and make a right or left on
Excuse
Fenimore Road. The Sheldrake, where it meets Fenimore Road, that's the concept. The slide on the far left. That is something that is absolutely pretty much self-maintains itself, and it's a low dollar. It's as you would say, reachable fruit.
Yeah.
Something that can be easily done. It welcomes individuals to explore the Sheldrake, which ultimately leads to our neighboring communities. Also, what Peter was saying about the balance. You go down to the industrial area on a Sunday, it's a ghost town. It's the balance. It's the synergy. It's trying to balance the activity without creating a permanent footprint which could hurt either the residents, neighboring residents, or the community itself.
Yeah. And so one thing you'll see, there's numbers and numbers next to each one of these. We created an implementation plan. Again, Eric will show that. So these ideas are pulled directly into the implementation plan, which is an action plan how to bring this to pilot. So they're cross-referenced. They're also on the boards later on if you want to see. Sports and recreation and beer. You can have a pint while your kid does soccer. Nice idea. but these kind of businesses could work there, as well as more pop-up and flexible things. These are a pretty important idea, and I point them out because these are what communities do, is sort of early action to get people excited, build momentum around the change. And so like food cart weekend or holiday market is an example. This is movie night. This is in South Carolina. They do a movie night in their own industrial area. You know, things like that. Things that bring people there before necessarily all the change has happened or as change is beginning. Sort of early wins. Flooding. There's a lot of sort of simple technology. It's called innovative, but it's really simple. How to hold and retain water. And we have a series of recommendations in the plan that are very pointed about how to deal with that. This idea of how to kind of connect to the village, either through walks. Cleveland has a historic walk, or we have even LA, Long Beach, which is the container port for the West Coast, the largest one, has a very complete bike path. Longshoremen can bike to their container things. So you can have bike lanes in industrial areas. These are the other ideas of pop-ups. They can be areas of respite, parks, places to hang out. Right now, there's no open space in the district, really to hang out, to have your lunch. And so in Brooklyn, this is one, our first office was in this building here, so we looked down at it. But you can see that they made this park by literally just painting an area and creating a space for people to hang out, and that was in Brooklyn. This is in Philadelphia. They just simply took a parking space and they put some benches there and outside of a cafe that served coffee. Also, people were hanging out in the middle of the day. And then we talked about one of the great challenges you guys well know is you have this rail line that sort of slices through the middle of the village and separates the west from the east. Separates the district, the industrial area, off from the rest. But there may be ways to connect that right off, or some interesting gestures. So we see elaborate things like in Chicago coming across Lakeshore Drive, or even in Holland they have their bike highways. But you can make these connections that work with the existing infrastructure. This is more of a long-term, glorious vision, but it's possible. And then traffic. One of the issues we hear about traffic is that it's going too fast. In some places it needs to slow down, other places it needs to push through. So a lot of the plan addresses that. But there's simple things to slow traffic down. You'll see some of these like texturing the stone, literally having cobbles or something that causes people to do. Or you can even just paint art in the middle of intersections. People actually slow down to look at it, weirdly enough. And this happened in Mississippi. So they have traffic calming in Mississippi. One of the things is also to kind of brand or create a vision for the district. And we can see this in the Distillery District in Toronto. Has anyone ever been there? It's a great old industrial. Philip in the back has. But a lot of people, if you get a chance to go there, it's one of the nicest places, Toronto, if you ask me. And it's really carefully branded and crafted as an industrial area about the maker economy, about things are made here, the food, the drink, and it becomes a destination that way. And then the High Line in New York, one of the things that people don't know about the High Line, or don't often notice, it has a great art program associated with it that supports the artists of Chelsea. And it kind of marks the High Line in other ways. So there are ways to mark the district in branding or with art that could help with the gateway on that. We talked a lot about how do you get business to start here. There's two examples here. The City of Chicago has 26 community business incubators they set up throughout the entire city. There's one guy can come and start his business there. Low rent, kind of as a catalyst. Or you can partner, like NYU does with their ACRE program, and that's a partnership between academic and a municipality partners to create and drive kind of incubator business. And the last thing I want to just touch on is one of the things to make the district more active is to make the street and the pedestrian experience more interesting. And so having some transparency at the ground level. This is Red Hook, which is an industrial district in Brooklyn, but it has storefronts that incite into people. And even this adaptive reuse of one in the Gowanus area of Brooklyn, they have a policy of keeping their door open so people can kind of see it, and it's not just a warehouse for electronic waste. So you can do simple things to kind of make it a more interesting experience to walk through during the day. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric now, my colleague, and he's going to take you through how this all got tied together in a coherent, logical way.
Before we turn over very quickly, I want to acknowledge we have some. First of all, thank you for being here tonight, you in the audience. We have some wonderful people, leaders of community groups here in the village of Mamaroneck. We have trustees that are present here tonight. Steve Otis, New York State Assembly, and the 91st District has also joined us this evening, and thank you for being here, because quite frankly, without the traction, without the support of just not local, but also county and state, thank you. You're going to assure the success of these endeavors that we've embarked upon. But thank you as residents of this community for taking the interest in being here, and also neighboring communities, town of Mamaroneck. We have people from the Larchmont here tonight. So I want to thank you. This is a collective macro effort. So thank you very much for being here. Oh, he's loading it. We will have a question and answer portion when Eric concludes his presentation. So please rest assured that if you have questions, suggestions, ideas, please stand by, and you'll have an opportunity to submit those. I feel like the call, the call center. Call, please, now. But
feel free to check the Met scores.
yeah, exactly. Anybody have a Met score for 809?
LMC, strike one.
Yeah, strike one, exactly. All right.
So while he's doing that, the process basically, he take you through sort of a vision incrementally how we address certain things like the concept of gateway. And as I said, it ends in this idea of an implementation.
They can hear you at home.
Implementation matrix, which is basically a menu upon which the village can choose to do certain of these things, and they're bucketed in terms of time. So there's short term, which is a low-hanging fruit, as Andrew said. So maybe that's like the truck fare. And then you have sort of intermediate, maybe that's 3 to 5 year action. And then there's long-term, maybe that's like a 10-year action. This will allow the village to strategically choose what they do. You don't have to do everything in the implementation plan, but also to plan in advance, and so that you're steadily moving, and also to gauge progress against the plan. And so over here on the charts, you'll see there's color-coded. We kind of did an economic one, physical, which is really kind of zoning and regulatory and the massing, the bulk of buildings. We did a social and cultural section, which is the orange, and blue, which is natural. So that deals like with flooding, open space, kind of habitat, those kind of issues. And those are a series of actions, and you can see they have a number so they can be cross-checked. They sort of have a name, they have a brief description, they have a precedent. So here's an example. You guys don't have to reinvent the wheel. People have done this before, so we give a nice reference so that it can guide if you have to make a plan or a regulation off of which. And again, it has time. And it also tells you what it impacts in terms of municipal sectors, whether it's impacts just commercial users or whatnot. After that dramatic pause, I'm going to turn over to Eric.
We see that our karaoke from Eric.
Is it still 0-0? Okay. So what I'm going to go over now is basically, there were a lot of great concepts in general presented by Peter. A lot of these came from the outreach that we did. A lot of it came just from us and from our experience. But now we want to talk about, well, what does that mean to this district? Where do those things go on the map, right? And how does it lead to implementation as that matrix goes, right? What are the steps we take? So one of the things that we really liked that came from the outreach was the idea of the center being marked, right? So there was, we talked about the idea of branding, but also I think more importantly, just as an identity of the village, as the district within the village. How do we mark that? And where do we mark that? Where is the entry? Where is the exit, right? We talked a lot about Fenimore being kind of a throughway through the district. And then we started talking about the fabric of the district and how parts of it are actually really interesting. The buildings hold the street. It's not just about 51% surface parking, but there's some opportunities we can take to make it a district where you want to be and where it's fun to walk and fun to eat your lunch outside. So we talked about Gateway. Again, some of this will be reiterated as Peter warned you, but talking about incubator space, right? So even though we're going to show you a slide later that talks about potentially incubator or office space in the industrial area, but very specifically, talking about how these co-working spaces, here's some examples, Serendipity Labs, ground floor co-working, are not just happening in Chicago and New York, they're happening in suburban or inner ring suburbs. It's something that has a demand across many different kinds of cities and sizes of cities. So what we talked about initially, and I actually want to keep the process very transparent because some of you weren't there when we were talking with the committee and the land use committee and commissions about a potential mixed-use zone. So let me describe really quickly before I move further about what mixed use means. When we first pitched the idea to the trustees and the committee, we actually were talking about Fenimore as a possible mixed-use corridor, meaning specifically commercial on the bottom, meaning retail or some kind of workspace, with actually residential on top. Now, we quickly abandoned that idea and actually changed it in two different key ways. One is we kind of said, let's let Fenimore be this throughway of truck traffic and those other things, and flip this mixed-use zone to Waverly and to pieces of Hoyt. Secondly, let's not have residential, right? So we're very sensitive of that. So we're not proposing any new residential units here. So I'll skip to the punchline there. But the idea of having office incubator space or some kind of allowing possibly, and I'll talk about this later, possibly an additional FAR or slightly different kind of density just along Waverly to kind of promote a more 24/7 kind of activity, specifically along Waverly and Hoyt, kind of coming from Mamaroneck Avenue as well as the train station. So I'll explain that a little bit more as we go. But what does that look like then, right? So you don't have to go very far north or south or in any direction. This is Norwalk, Connecticut. The idea of having a 3-story kind of street wall condition where we say, obviously industrial can still happen here at the base. There can be carpenters, furniture showrooms as well as furniture makers, welding shops, but maybe there's offices on top. Maybe there's medical offices, law offices, or offices associated with that industry below. Or like we said, incubator space or co-working space. But then one of the things we will show you is that the idea of kind of having two different faces in the district of night versus day. So one of the comments that came out of outreach was, man, it's a pity that the place basically shuts down at 6 p.m. Actually, like a lot of cities in our country, but the way around that is to have a mix of uses. So if you can picture Waverly for a second as being obviously still industrial, but is there a way for it to at night kind of transform? You can do restaurants as of right along Fenimore currently. You can't currently do it as of right along Waverly. So we would essentially flip that overlay or add on to that overlay to allow Waverly to become this kind of night and day concept. We're also very sensitive not to compete with Mamaroneck Avenue, with Restaurant Row, right? We want to build on that and potentially make it a different kind of place, right? Is this more, is it in terms of the food industry, is it more about startups or also building upon, the fish smoking, the smokehouse places as well as some others? But is it also a little bit more of a bar scene than Mamaroneck Avenue is? So I think it can complement it and be different. And of course, we talked about other, as Andrew said, low-hanging fruit. Something that came out of the outreach, at volume 10, was the idea of why aren't we utilizing Sheldrake River as connecting to some trails that we have. There's Leatherstocking Trail just to the north that kind of wraps through much of the village and then the town to the north. There's no reason we couldn't have, industry and Riverwalk coexisting. Go ahead, Andrew.
Jump in a second, because what we found is also the industrial area is somewhat cut off from the rest of the communities. What I mean by that is we're surrounded by I-95, New Haven line, and then the Sheldrake. This would be a way, the river, this would be a way for individuals, whether they wanted to walk, bike, and experience this area with family. And if they chose to go further down the road, down to Larchmont, or go further north to our communities to the and neighbors to the north. So it really was a way to bring people in, not necessarily relying on their vehicles, but also on foot or bicycle.
And this specific example is actually the Gowanus Canal. If anyone's familiar with that at all, it's one of the dirtiest canals in our country. It's a few blocks from my house. And, if we can do it there and kind of, just sort of do education, river walks and other things, and meanwhile we're cleaning it up, right? So there's things we can do along the Sheldrake, even in the most industrial parts, specifically in the north along where the waste transfer station is. There's no reason that stuff can't coexist. I'm going to skip through that so we can keep moving. But one of the key things, that came out of a lot of the outreach, as well as just our own thinking, is that Andrew actually said the word, clean slate earlier. That's actually the opposite of what we want to do, and we actually want to capitalize on what's there and kind of enhance what's there. So obviously there's, the squash in the southern sort of southwestern area. There's the UFC gym as well. But we started to kind of think of what if we started to zone certain areas. I don't think it's not completely finished yet. It's kind of it's sort of an open discussion on how necessary is it to do this, but to encourage certain uses to cluster for efficiency, to deal with traffic issues a little bit better, but also to build on what's there. So this idea that there could be a kind of a fitness fitness area where maybe businesses are a little bit incentivized. Maybe there's something kind of in an overlay of the zoning that tends to kind of gently push those industries in that area, right? And then we've got these other areas as well. But also this notion, going into the fitness notion here, finding that, as Andrew put it, this indoor fitness facility or some kind of indoor soccer, lacrosse, where would that go? So part of our soft site analysis, as Peter talked about, where there's 700,000 square feet of unused floor area ratio that you have in your existing zoning code, we need a bulk of that to go somewhere, right? Because one of these indoor facilities is anywhere from 90,000 square feet to 150,000 square feet, based on kind of the I-95 corridor. And what's really interesting is that when we looked at the economics, it turns out that 80% of Mamaroneck's residents go elsewhere.
Wait, I want
to
you to repeat that.
yeah,
So
80
people at home can also
right.
hear that again.
In terms of recreation and entertainment, that includes sports and indoor sports facilities. 80% of Mamaroneck residents go outside of Mamaroneck for that, whether it's north, south, or west, right? When you take it as in terms of sales, what that 80% means, and then kind of work backwards to price per square sales rent cost per square foot, you basically need 130,000 square feet of indoor recreation or entertainment. And now that's a pretty large umbrella, and I think it also includes movie theaters and such. But it just so happens that a great example to the north in Woodbridge, Connecticut. This is about 115,000 square foot indoor facility. So something like this is perfect. It's perfect for Mamaroneck in the sense that your market can bear it. We think from our analysis, the demand is there.
And I think the traffic also, the biggest concern, one of the larger concerns that people have expressed to us is traffic. Traffic, we can't afford to be burdened by that. And I think a concept like this would balance that out, because for purposes of high school, middle school, lower school kids, that would balance nicely with the current uses, because they won't be there during the day. It would be after school activities or on Saturdays and Sundays. And for parents, for club activities, that's actually obviously 7 p.m. through 10 p.m. So that's where you get your balance. So when we say 24/7, I don't want people to walk away from this thinking, oh my goodness, it's going to be like the Vegas Strip, lights and glitter and this. Well, you can have glitter, but the fact is it's a balance, and I think that's really important.
One of the potential red flags is, well, where do those people park? Well, our position with the committee and others has been that this kind of facility would not need a municipal parking lot or deck per se. It would be just in the current land use and zoning code. There would be a certain amount of parking required for this size of facility. And so whoever develops this facility is responsible for implementing that parking, whether it's below grade. And actually the site we proposed actually is on the highest part. It's actually in part of that 43% that's not in the flood area. So a basement, some kind of basement parking might be viable, or some kind of second floor deck or something on grade could possibly work. This is just that. So I'm checking my numbers. Yes, 80% go elsewhere. 130,000 square feet is what the market is what the demand can bear. So we started thinking about, if it's not here, the recreation anchor, maybe it's elsewhere. I think there's other places it can go. I think that needs to be studied in a separate RFP or something. But either way, the notion that it could tie in to this river walk and into a buffer zone is interesting to us. It could be something that maybe along Ogden Avenue, there's a green street of some kind, or a wayfinding where maybe there's also a kayak program or something in the Sheldrake that's associated with the indoor facility. It doesn't have to be in isolation. So your mayor and some other trustees have been working diligently with the Army Corps of Engineers, as a lot of you might know, in dealing with some of these larger flood issues. I think it's important to remember that this is a small area within a very, very large watershed, right? So when there's a 100-year event, meaning rain that is so big it happens every 100 years, or a 50-year event, that's almost a regional scale, or a much larger scale than the industrial area. And that's something that the Army Corps studies are looking at addressing, where to widen the Sheldrake and where not to, and also its tributaries and other larger waterways. But there are things that, I would say, you guys know better than me, but 4 times every summer, at the bridges, at the low points, it's flooded. And those don't have to be 50-year events. Sometimes it's just a really hard thunderstorm. And that's why we're talking about certain passive, relatively low-cost things we can do, like the urban sponge that Peter showed earlier with the kind of grading below grade. That kind of stuff can really minimize a 5-year event or the 1-year event. It's not going to minimize the 100-year event. And that's not what this study is about, frankly. It's not about fixing a 50-year flood or even a 20-year flood. But I think it's about making sure that something that really shouldn't be flooding that area is starting to get minimized, right? There's no reason that should flood 4, 5, 6 times a year. So one of the things that is a little bit contentious, I think, with the current zoning is that actually the way it's written is so that auto body businesses can't be within 100 feet or something of each other, right? So it's the idea of spreading out that kind of those potential smaller brownfield sites, right? The oil and the gasoline and other things, and making sure they're not clustered so as to make one larger brownfield site. But as part of our kind of sub area and reorganizing the districts slightly and gently over time, one of the things we were talking about is having auto-related moving to the north of Fenimore, and that's something I think that still needs to be studied by the city planning commission, as well as if there's a kind of buffer between the residential district and that district, how big really should it be? There's a couple of vacant lots that potentially they can be purchased by the city, or there can be a deal worked out where there's an easement that gets a little bit wider from the Sheldrake.
And it's a direct response to the comprehensive plan, this idea of buffering the auto uses for other
You're just making sure you're using the mic.
Sorry. It's a direct response to the comprehensive plan, the idea of buffering auto uses for residential areas.
And again, none of this is trying to be too heavy-handed. If this can't work, I think there's other solutions. But what it might do is it might help ease traffic in the sense that sometimes along Fenimore, you get kind of the car storage of some of the auto body shops kind of bleeding out and taking over some of the street parking that would otherwise be used by people, by other businesses. So it's a way of kind of organizing some of that, as well as, as I'll talk about later, if we want a kind of street wall here, meaning, a building that comes up and defines the sidewalk edge and creates that kind of feel, that urban feel we're talking about and some of the precedents, it's hard to do that with an auto body shop. You can do it. It's done a lot, but it's letting them, it's sort of saying, let them be who they are over here. They don't have to hold the street wall. They can store cars differently there, but it can be a way of tweaking the zoning to allow that to happen and for everyone to win. And then there's a kind of product supply and export, which we think is very much related to the industrial rail spur coming in, which is still used during the night. So of the 17 or 21, I think it might even be 23, current residential parcels that are in the industrial district, they're non-complying, but they're allowed to be there. It's a non-complying use. That happens all the time in cities. The problem is usually you can't add on to that house. If it, you can't voluntarily tear it down and rebuild something that's going to be a 3-family building there. But you can stay there. So we've talked a lot about that with the committee and with the land use commissions. And what we're starting to think of is something where, like we're kind of, trying to organize the site, we notice, well, a lot of them are here. 16 of the 23 are in this zone along Fayette Avenue and Center Avenue. What if there was a kind of live-work overlay that allowed all of a sudden those non-complying parcels to basically be complying? And what we mean by live-work is that over time, let's say they do want to rebuild that building, they could still build a residence there, right? So that's what's different about the non-complying use, but it would have a kind of condition to it. That condition could be that it has to be a live-work building. What's a live-work building? I hear someone ask, right? What is that? We did a very comprehensive study for the Economic Development Corporation in New York City about what that is. And frankly, we're still kind of doing this study internally. But it's everything from, the idea of an artist's loft, right? Or the idea of an office space in your home, right, that doesn't have great light, so you use it as an office, to a basement workshop, but something even a little bit more formalized, like a live-work townhouse that has, some kind of industrial workspace beneath it and living quarters above. So these are not just the scale of an apartment, could be the scale of more of a building. We looked at, in this particular study, we looked at 20-unit, 30-unit buildings. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a 1 or 2 family building, preferably maybe even just a 1-family building. But again, the idea is that that person works there. And we're seeing this more and more. There's a reason why the NYC EDC asked us to do that study. It's something that's spurring up in Boston and a lot of other places, San Diego, California, Pittsburgh. So we think that's an interesting thing to keep looking at, specifically for that area on the map. So that's what that starts to look at as a kind of sub-area map, and then a kind of more refined map. Again, figuring out exactly what that buffer looks and feels like, how it affects those property owners, I think is something that it's on the matrix. It still needs to be studied. We haven't cracked it, but it relates to the flood issues, right, of the Sheldrake and many other physical issues. So I want to get back to quickly to the Waverly Avenue density increase that I talked about before we start drawing too many conclusions. And again, it may not be something, frankly, that even the market can bear. I think over time, it's very possible. Over time, as we allow that density increase, that alone sometimes can spur interest, spur development interest, specifically because we're talking about allowing office buildings, which currently could actually be done as of right. But what we would do is we would add simply a 0.5 FAR. So just as a quick lesson, floor area ratio 1.0 means you're literally building one level on your entire parcel, or half your parcel 2 stories, right? So it's taking that floor area and multiplying it upwards as a building. So when we talk about a 1.5, that's something where maybe it's a 50% lot coverage, 3 stories, right? But we wouldn't increase the industrial density. We'd keep that at 1.0, which is what it is currently. We'd add basically an overlay to allow these incubator spaces or office spaces associated with that industry or not to come in. It's not live work like the area is to the north of that. It's a different kind of thing.
It's a model that, again, like a lot of municipalities, like New York City's looking at how to marry light industry with other uses on a section basis, vertically stacking up. So
Yeah. So why do we want the 1.5? Well, you know, we looked at what physically the street means at a 1.0, 1.5, 2.0. There are not a lot of successful kind of 24-hour streets, or even, you know, streets that are active till 9 or 10 p.m. that are 1.0, frankly. So part of it is literally to drive that demand and to literally drive the physical street section, right, that we're looking at. So you can see that 1.5 in the middle as a kind of common, as a middle ground. We looked at a 2.0, which is actually similar to something like Williamsburg and Brooklyn, or the East Village in Manhattan, if you've been there.
1.5 is Georgetown in DC.
Right. So you'll see in 1.5 districts, you'll see a mix of 1-story sometimes, 1-story, 2-story, and 3-story buildings. And again, it's all about having the mix of uses. Like, it's the idea that accepting the theory that a healthy street is a street that's diverse of its use, right? It's not just a single thing. And that's what we're thinking about for Waverly and for a section of Hoyt. We're also looking at this notion that it can connect back to the rail, and I think even more importantly, back to Mamaroneck Avenue. So the idea of connecting back to the village. I think it's important to have some kind of anchor at the end of this, which fit nicely with where we thought the indoor recreation facility could go. Again, it doesn't have to be.
Just giving people perspective here, this would be Waverly Avenue.
Yeah, you can see the rail here.
Wait. So, obviously the railroad.
So halftime is down here, as you guys know, and so I mean this is already kind of an interesting strip that's happening with halftime moving in, and you know it's a little bit odd next to the berm here, but we'll get to some things that we're planning on down here as well, to sort of liven that area. We weren't doing this in a vacuum, as Andrew and Peter both said. We were looking at previous studies. This is one from 2004 that talked about how to improve the streetscape of Waverly. So, you know, part of the criticism of this study is that it for the sake of having some trees and some curb bump outs, we're taking away a little bit of parking spaces. So the idea is that we want to find a balance. You know, so this might have gone, you know, one way to the left. We want to pull back a little bit to the right. Maybe there's not as many bump outs. Maybe there's not as many trees on Waverly. Just because we want a healthy street doesn't mean it has to have trees. We've shown you some examples that look quite lively that don't have them, and it is an industrial
and aesthetically
area.
pleasing. So it's
Yeah,
not
I mean,
concrete
it's yes.
to actually landscape by art or
Yes.
other devices.
There's
that
other things we can do. It doesn't have to be the only answer. But looking at what we're talking about with this 24/7 concept, this notion that something very gently again in the zoning code, and also with what we do with the streetscape, you can very easily come up with a solution where what is loading or parking during the day becomes a street cafe, cafe seating or something at night. So it's a very, very simple idea of just, we showed that example of Philadelphia turning a parking space into a park. That's a little bit more permanent as a solution, even though it's a pop-up park. But the idea that just as soon as 6:30 happens, normally the industrial area gets very quiet. Maybe there's 3 or 4 restaurants on Waverly that start to spill out onto the street, and we'll show you, how we kind of think that looks. So again, once, it's a loading zone at 9 a.m. So you literally just let the sidewalk become loading.
Eric, using that particular diagram, can you expand on the parking regarding Waverly and Fenimore? Because this is always obviously a theme here in the community.
Right. So this is a street section through Waverly Avenue, right? So it's wide enough currently as it's mapped to be a 4-lane street. What we're imagining is that 2 of those lanes could actually be parking. Doesn't have to just be on one side of the street, and then we still have two-way traffic. And I believe at a certain point it becomes one way, but I forget where that is. Where's our city engineer? There. Yeah, closer to Fenimore. It changes to one way. So
But I think it is also using creative skills in terms of parking, because, for example, if you want to take your kids and you want to go down there, parking-wise, to be able to provide the opportunity to find parking, whether it be through meters or
or a central
limitations,
location
for example,
paying.
so that businesses aren't just unloading their cars out and utilizing those spots from other people that would otherwise come down there and contribute to the local economy.
If you go down there at 10:30 a.m. on Tuesday, you'll see trucks parked where the sidewalk would normally be, and it's sort of, the sidewalk's kind of been erased by asphalt over time, and there's kind of a haphazardness, and basically, it's not heavily regulated. That's part of the solution, is actually regulatory issues. So another thing we wanted to talk about with the 1.5 FAR increase is that we would like to maintain, our position is that we'd like to maintain the 45-foot height rule that currently exists. So right now it's a 1.0 FAR with a 45-foot height, but also a 3-story height limit. So you cannot cram 5 stories into 45 feet. So it's one or the other, whichever is less. But the thing that we've talked about a lot recently in the last few months, and you'll see it on the implementation matrix boards, is to basically redefine what that 45 feet is, basically at the new FEMA flood line, which in cities all along the East Coast, that's starting to happen. The FEMA maps have all changed after Hurricane Sandy. So it's really unfair for property owners who are 6 feet below a certain datum line to be required to build 45 feet from the curb line. It actually should be from a datum line. And New York City is doing this, where they give a height bonus depending on where you're located, and San Francisco and other cities are doing this. I'm going to skip forward a little bit to basically the illustrative site plan. So you guys have probably seen this over in the station if you came here a little earlier, but this is starting to get at, where are these things going, right? Where are these precedents starting to take place? So again, one possible location for this recreation center is currently where the car storage is for one of the dealerships, and some parking lots. So you can see that there. There's other larger assemblages of parcels that it could be located, where it could be located. But again, we like the idea of pulling, of kind of a magnet, right, so to speak, pulling people through Waverly. The notion of Sheldrake being, I think phased in terms of developing trails and river walks along the Sheldrake, but keeping it quite natural, and coexisting with industry. Here's the image of Norwalk, Connecticut in terms of a scale that we're talking about of industrial and office mixed use along Waverly. And then, what Peter talked about before as a food truck kind of fair or something of that nature, possibly along Hoyt. I've joked previously that if I was the owner of Halftime, I would pay for everyone's food truck license to come over every Sunday and set up a tent. But that's just me. The idea of passive flood mitigation, especially in the low-lying areas closer to the rail to the east. The idea of again, changing back and forth between what happens during the night and during the day. There's a certain kind of organic quality that the growth of the district may have. We don't want to limit this kind of thing to Waverly necessarily. Right, we talk about sub-districting the district, but quite frankly, along Center and Fayette, there's some very, very interesting building stock and very viable properties that could start to take on some of these uses if the nature of the district, started to slowly change. In particular, the old rubber factory up here on Fayette, is a very interesting building for a venue or for a business. There's a flower company in there now. So it's actually some quite nice buildings around that. We don't have to, put all of our attention to Waverly. That's the point. The idea of urban trail along Fenimore, the idea that, as you guys know, Leatherstocking Trail is sometimes just disjointed across Fenimore and some other areas. But is there a way to continue that kind of trail right through Fenimore by means of marking or wayfinding or paving pattern? And then down the line, as we talk to the MTA several different times, maybe some kind of connection down into Hoyt. But it's a broader discussion, and that kind of keys into what Peter was talking about earlier about the idea that there's 1 to 5 year implementation ideas, there's 5 to 10, and then there's longer term.
And there are ones that you could start next week, much
Yeah.
like the truck fairs on the
Mhm.
weekends, shutting down one of the streets in the interior part of the industrial area, where you would not be impacting either residents or businesses like that are closed on Sundays, and being able to bring in people so they can explore it and have a feel for what's down there.
So I think I'll just brush over these real quick, but Peter talked about the idea that bike trails can live in industrial areas. It's true, and frankly, Waverly has a width that can support that if we'd like to do that, and connect to other trails in and around the village. And the idea of constantly thinking about semi-trucks. We're constantly drawing semi-trucks in our drawings, and making sure that if we propose a bump out of some kind or that it can support the turning radius of a truck. It's detailed stuff, but it's very, very important for the district to keep that in mind, as well as how big should this bump out be, and how many parking spaces does it take away. But then having it there also allows trucks to get around, to move about more freely. What's happening currently is some of this parking will literally just sort of flow out. There's van storage, there's auto body shops that start to take over parking spaces, like I was saying. Everyone's got their needs, and there's not quite enough space, even though it's 51%, asphalt parking, like Peter said. There's never enough. So it's all coexisting. So we have to figure out how to, make win-win situations. And then finally along Hoyt and Fenimore, where we talked about possibly a food market of, we're showing this is summer of 2018 after it really takes off, but it's actually not it's not hard to believe. If you look at Troy, New York, a little bit more to the north, they have an annual one that's very, very large, but they have other smaller ones where it's common to see 15, 16, 17 food trucks show up and tons of people, and cities even closer have this as well. So there's no reason we couldn't do it here. There's a wide enough sidewalk if we slightly realign Hoyt without slowing traffic down. And also even along Ogden, like Andrew's saying, that could even happen next week on parts of that road. So existing, here's what it looks like. The slightly brown you're not going to see this in the camera probably, but we're calling out what the residential is. So we're constantly keeping that in mind as non-complying, but perfectly legal to be there now. And then the existing gray buildings here are industrial or commercial uses. What we're talking about is a 1 to 5 year, looking for catalytic projects or projects that can jumpstart the district, especially this sports facility or some other kind of anchor, or possibly a couple of developers taking advantage of the office overlay along the intersection of Waverly and Fenimore here. Maybe something associated with the recreation facility across from Waverly as a 1 to 5 year idea, and then a 5 to 10. What if Waverly really takes off as this new district? Maybe this is an incubator of some kind or a co-sharing space, and then it starts to take off. It becomes a kind of mini tech hub because of the fiber optic line that's running literally 12 feet beneath the ground, right? So there's that kind of opportunity. And then finally, what starts to happen up here along Fayette? Does other light industry start to come in, and now that it's a very happening, area that everyone wants to be in, right? So it's kind of like this aspirational outlook of 10 to 20 years down the road.
Eric, if I could, before we get to the matrix that you have, in the past, during our presentations and workshops, we've allowed the opportunity for people to make suggestions and comments and ask questions. And we are somewhat into this program, and the Met Game is on. I would like to ask, if to just take a pause for a second, and ask if anybody in the room has either comments or questions or ideas that we could take down. So let's take a couple minutes, and we're going to use this mic if that's okay. Come on up, and please, comments, questions, ideas. Or I could throw the mic over to you, but. What? No, this is for LMC-TV.
Yeah, my name is James Abadi. Is it on?
This is actually for LMC-TV.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. My name's James Abadi, a lifelong resident, 56 years, Mamaroneck. Just so you guys know, I'm not against anything. I think they're great ideas. I'm a business owner. I would love to capitalize on something like this. At the same time, being a resident 2 blocks away from this, and also at the same time you guys are composing all of this, they're talking about TOD on the other end. So far, the comparisons have been with cities. The word out of your mouth are cities. We're a small village, and I really think they're good ideas, but the best thing I heard about this whole thing was the recreation facility. We live on Washington Street, and I'm going to tell you, right now, without anything being built, it's madness. And I don't want to shoot everything down, but there's no way, unless you can put another entrance to the thruway so when the cars come off, they can get back on. Because coming across any of the small streets that we live on, I can't even get out of my driveway as it is. And it's, I just want to say that even with the great ideas, and I love it, it's beautiful, but really, a lot of work's got to be done before anything could happen because the traffic is horrendous. Forget the flooding. That's going to happen. We understand they're working on it, but the traffic is horrendous. And for all of this to take place in our small village that I've lived in all my life, I can't see anything but catastrophe. I got to say, I know you guys are working on it and you guys, look at it from different avenues, but unless you build streets or another entrance to a throughway, that traffic is coming past my house and past everybody that lives here. We're in a small village. It's not a city. Portchester, Yonkers, you've compared it to cities. And I think it's just a little crazy to try to take it to that extreme. And
Well, first and foremost, you've been very active, and we appreciate that. You've been very vocal. You've expressed your ideas, and I think that's very important. And when you compare other studies historically, we pride ourselves on that transparency and having that feedback. And I think the good thing is many of the concepts that have been brought to the table, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, much like when they made reference to our city manager, it's very easy. So we're a village and a town, and what are we? So
I never heard village or town. I've heard cities.
I'm just saying, I believe that when they make references to cities, a lot of these photographs, and some of these photographs are taken from other communities that are similar to ours. But the issue of traffic is absolutely paramount. We've entertained individuals here who live in the town of Mamaroneck who've been expressed concern about that. I've received emails from individuals in the town of Mamaroneck. So this is obviously something that is very much in the forefront. We're not brushing this off. And I think as we progress, our committee, in conjunction to the residents of Washingtonville, are very much going to be able to arrive at something that will balance and not harm or exacerbate the situation. And again, you have been very involved in this process, and we thank you for that.
Right. Thank you.
So
guys.
we take it as productive
I appreciate it.
input. Thank you.
Sir, I would like to say thank you also, and to say guilty as charged. We tend to use the word city, and I apologize. We really do mean village. It's just we tend to work a lot for cities, and that comes out of our mouths by habit. But I will say that if you look at the implementation, there's a lot of very direct, based on comments that you gave and other Washingtonville residents gave about having to deal with a larger planning and the issues of traffic cutting through Washingtonville from the district
today and no matter what happens in the future there. And so we don't pretend to have an answer today, but I do believe we're recognizing the issue and trying to acknowledge that there has to be a path forward that doesn't make this a stressor on the Washingtonville community.
The only thing I want to say is when you compared, even your presentation was Yonkers, Port Chester, New Rochelle. They're twice the size of our little village in Mamaroneck.
They're the healthiest. That's a good thing. They're the healthiest industrial areas in the region, and your village competes with them. I think you should not be apologetic or upset about that benchmarking, because it shows that you're playing as a smaller community. You're playing against bigger communities in terms of vitality, richness of your community, and I think that's a good thing.
But my whole point was, I understand that, and that's great. I'm glad that we do that. But once again, the traffic that's going to come our way is the problem.
Part of the matrix that we have right behind you, that's item number one. And I guess the bottom line is obviously tonight, tomorrow, we're not going to have that answer, but in conjunction, working together, that's the goal.
Yeah,
That's the goal.
and
Right,
afterwards, I
exactly.
can go over some of the particular recommendations in detail with you. I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Hi, Rita O'Connor. Lifelong resident of Washington Street. Unfortunately, I didn't know what Jim was going to say, but I have to kind of back up exactly what his comments are. I happen to be Jim's neighbor, so I feel his pain. I applaud you for your vision and your ideas. I think they're great. I'm for development, and especially for that area, because it's been an eyesore for many years. But again, like what Jim was saying, you have residents and a number of streets that are going to be sandwiched in between the TOD zone and this zone. We've expressed our concerns for many years on flooding, congestion, and traffic in our streets. Big problem. So until those problems get corrected, it's hard for me to envision this happening, because I just see the problems getting worse. Again, I know, I'm kind of just saying what Jim is saying, and you guys don't have answers for us tonight, but that is a major concern for the residents of that area.
Here's the good news with respect to some of the flooding and mitigation. In fact, one of the chairs of the Flood Mitigation Advisory Committee is here this evening, but the bottom line is that there are steps being taken, proactive measures by the village on a day-to-day or monthly basis to enhance the infrastructure, to alleviate some of the pressure, especially in the industrial area where there are some pressure points on Hoyt and Vennamore. So the things that we can do, where obviously, as we all know, unless we get hydraulics to lift the entire village, that's not going to happen. So there's ways that we can encourage type of development, building, whether it be Vancouver's example of the sidewalks that retains the water, things like that. But again, this is a progressive and proactive step. Very acutely aware of flooding issues. I think we all suffered tremendously several years ago, and that still resonates very deep in our minds. We haven't forgotten that, and that stays on our forefront. In conjunction, again, learning from other studies. I want the input of the Flood Mitigation Advisory Committee. I'm on that committee. I want their input. I welcome their input, and I welcome any other hydrologists or anyone else that can contribute to what the study we've already done.
And then in the implementation plan, there's a series of pointed recommendations that mesh with the larger activity the village is proposing to deal with flooding, but deal with within the industrial zone on a parcel, on a street level, of ways to address flooding. On parking, there's also recommendations. Again, I'll be happy to go through these in great detail if anyone, that deal with parking and traffic flow issues. We openly acknowledge that change brings change, bring change to the flow of traffic and all that. But smart planning and thinking about it today will allow it to be successful and not be a stressor on the residents of Washingtonville, because I don't think anyone's goal set in any of this activity is to do that.
All right. Well, just, again, what Jim had mentioned, the concern is there's a exit ramp off of 95.
Fenimore, right.
Right. So, and there's no entrance ramp. So everyone exiting into that area has to flow through our streets in order to get out of that area. I mean, we see it now. Washington Street is a major cut through for those who want to go back onto the Hutch or 95 or certain parts of Mamaroneck Avenue. So I can't see adding extra cars in that area right now. It's just, major congestion. And then again, we have the Waverly Avenue Bridge, which I think we've talked about in the
Sure.
past, possibly closing that and redirecting the traffic.
And the walk bridge on
Right.
Center Avenue. Yep.
But, you know, I would love to see that happen, only because that would alleviate some of the traffic that we get, but then you have an overflow somewhere else. Yeah, right, exactly. Where does it go? It goes to Hoyt, right. But, yeah, it goes to Hoyt. So, and that's, you know, I don't know if that's a fix.
At the beginning of the program presentation, we were talking about getting that balance. Rather than peak hours, avoiding that peak hour type of environment with businesses, having the type that actually spread it out so it's not all lined up along Waverly and Fenimore or Hoyt. I've been down there at 7 o'clock in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's gridlock. We have gridlock in Mamaroneck, and that's one of the ideas that we've arrived at, to spread it out more evenly. And getting back to what you said about flooding, by the way, we don't have to dive into it in depth, but with the grant that we will hopefully get from the feds, that now comes into play with the county and with the state. And the traction that we have and the support that we have from various individuals, that's going to help. In fact, again, we have somebody here this evening of the New York State Assembly that is hearing us loud and clear. And our messages will be brought up higher so that the voices are heard and they don't go unheard. And these wonderful plans don't just, again, sit on somebody's desk. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
The mayor.
Yeah, I would just like to note that there are causes and effects for this entire program. Being involved directly with the committee, with other members of the Board of Trustees, eventually we will get it. I can tell you, as far as flooding is concerned, the Village of Mamaroneck and the Army Corps of Engineers has reached a point of agreement where we did the first third. The first third is deciding what program we're going to do. The next step will be getting funds, probably $8 to $10 million from the federal government to do the engineering, and the third stage obviously would be to get funding to implement that program. But it's all tied together. Actually, Steve Otis is here, and George Latimer helped the Village of Mamaroneck regarding exactly what Jim just talked about, which is now we're going to be able to address parking in the Washingtonville area and also near the other side off Jefferson Avenue. We will be able to restrict parking to residents only. That is only part and parcel of what it is. People will still cut through. There are many potential ideas that are out there. The one problem that I would suggest, what I did note, Andrew touched upon it, and you noted it in one of the slides. You were talking about street parking. My concern is looking at the slides of the entire build-out, there was no central parking structure. I think if you're going to build out this entire area, you're going to need a central parking structure. One, to handle the traffic, and two, quite honestly, while this is great to increase the tax base of the Village of Mamaroneck, it would be great to have a continuous stream of revenue for the Village of Mamaroneck, which help maintain it.
Thank you, Mayor. If may, there's one thing. Eric was just about to show sort of views of the Waverly today, tomorrow, and if that'd be helpful as a to spur conversation, I'd be happy to do that. We have some renderings. I guess I'll do that. So,
Right, so
yeah, here, why don't you?
We wanted to just show,
I'm going to get you.
you know, kind of speaking of the build-out comment is, you know, and it's we definitely note that, Mayor, about, you know, once there's a certain kind of demand, and we're not there yet, even though half the district is a parking lot, a surface parking lot, there's not a demand for, let's say, a 3-story deck currently. There's probably a demand elsewhere along, you know, the rear side of Mamaroneck Avenue or some other place, but currently not right now in terms of economic feasibility. But if you see this kind of density actually happening, there would be a demand for some kind of parking. And it could be municipal parking, depending on how the pro forma would work out, and that could be revenue for the city. Or also it could be private. You know, maybe it's actually viable enough for a private developer to come in and you know, make money off of parking, off of the success of the district. And you know, so that's well noted, and I think it kind of depends on the success, and you know, as we mentioned, the unbuilt area, 700,000 square feet. Even if there was no new ideas, even if there was no rezoning of any kind, if for some reason some other global issue happens and Mamaroneck all of a sudden builds out, right? It will go from 1.2 million square feet of built area right now to 1.9. So it's an additional 60% as of right that could be there, right? So it doesn't even seem viable in our heads right now, right? Because it's congested and it's, there's not enough parking. But that's the reality, is that technically under current zoning, it could support another 700,000 square feet. So I think the idea of parking coming in due time when it can, I think is definitely something to think about. We wanted to show these renderings real fast, just to show the scale of what we were thinking for Waverly. That's looking towards Ogden Avenue as we're on Waverly.
South.
Looking south, right? So you can see, that existing building here, which is actually a recent sale at $16 a square foot for rent.
Where is that? Where's this photograph from?
So actually, this is.
Well,
see,
we know that one.
We're on Waverly. It's the same, right? So it's almost the same view. You can see this building,
There you go.
and it's here. We're just talking about what if Waverly starts to fill in, as a place.
And we are going to bring in the mountains in the background, by the way.
We are
I
bringing
promise
the
you.
mountains.
I promise you.
Those are just really
Yes.
tall trees, I believe. Here's what we're talking about. Like, I don't think this sports facility has to be quite that tall in the rendering. It's probably more of a one-story, of a taller one-story, like a 40-foot one-story building. But the notion of, if you look closely in terms of the uses, like allowing a lot of industry to still exist, allowing trucks to move about freely during the day, capitalizing on food industries such as the Sheldrake Brewery, which I'm starting up next month. Maybe there's already furniture showrooms and other things that should still be allowed to live there and occupy Waverly. But then again at night, this looks a little bit too active. This looks a little not active enough, and so we're gonna talk about getting more people in there, and then a little less here. But you get the idea that it has two different faces. The industry or industrial area as a whole, perhaps, in terms of a potential movie night once a month, but also just the cafes and things. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Eileen Finn. I live on Revere Road, which is between Rockland Avenue and Weaver Street off of Harmon Drive. And from what I'm hearing, that whole area has been totally neglected from consideration in this proposal. We'll have a lot of the Waverly Avenue traffic cutting through, and it goes straight out to Weaver Street. You can get onto 95 down on Myrtle Boulevard. No consideration has been given to that area with all this new proposal. And nighttime entertainment there, while it's a great idea, it's going to ruin the enjoyment and quietness of the community where we've lived. I've lived there for 50 years now, so.
What street again? Tell us
We're on
exactly.
Revere Road, but that whole area has been totally neglected. It seems to only be the Washingtonville section that you've been dealing with as far as that goes. You haven't talked about any buffering on our side of the area.
If I may.
Actually, let me jump in. So actually, the emails I received, and I think several meetings ago, we did have a workshop, and there were two individuals there that actually did live on the south end, over by Rockledge, and further up in Mamaroneck town, and that was one of the concerns that was raised in terms of traffic cutting back to the Hutch, going that way, going south. So,
Well, we have so much traffic coming through there now, it's incredible.
I understand.
Speeding all the time. No one stops for the stop signs. We had a 3-year-old killed many years ago playing in his front yard. Most recently, up to last month, we had property damage to a wall on our street because of speeding car. It has to be a consideration in all that you're considering here.
And again, on the forefront, that is something that has been considered. And fortunately, as I said, we have received several comments from people that live on the southern and southwest side quadrant of the industrial area.
So a couple of points, because we covered a lot, but couldn't say everything. One of the ways we separated and only have this nighttime activity in Waverly, it ends at Ogden, and using the use to slow it down. The other thing is subtle, but we're recommending that cobbles and things like that slow down the traffic.
But you're putting the fitness and sports facilities at our end, which is going to be the busiest of all of them, in all probability.
Okay.
right? And there's going to be the most traffic coming to that area there.
Yeah, but you should, yeah. Okay.
So
Well-
ideally, I don't think that's the right end of it. It should be at the other end where they can get back, if, somehow get to the highway easier. But,
But,
well, unfortunately, yes,
well,
but
here's,
they need to develop another one onto
I'm
another
going
entrance
to
or
just
something,
interject a
but-
second. And again, these are things that we need to discuss and explore. But I will say this, the use of that type of facility is a little bit more, you don't have that peak type of use like other type of businesses. So I think it'd be more the flow. And again, I'm not a specialist in that type of operation, but could imagine that there wouldn't be that type of high dense peak type of traffic. But again, these are things that we need to discuss.
But this
and-
community is more sports-minded, so
Well,
it would
well,
be
that's-
extremely popular.
and hence,
So maybe it needs to be
that-
more in the center or
Well,
something.
that's-
but,
you know what?
not on the ends.
I think I want
Absolutely.
to be clear that we showed one possible location, and this is
nothing's set in stone.
nothing
No,
set
I
in stone.
understand
And
that.
I think that's a very good point, that this location of it has to be
Thank-
sensitive to residential uses.
On
in
both sides.
On
Right,
both sides.
absolutely.
And I think that's an excellent point. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for being here. Ms. Jackson.
Hi, my name is Peggy Jackson. I apologize for missing most of your presentation. We were in a flood committee meeting, so if what I'm saying is no longer appropriate, I apologize. As our mayor pointed out, the Army Corps is about to undertake a project, we hope, in the village. How are you coordinating with the Army Corps? You have 700,000 square foot of development. How is that being coordinated with the Army Corps' project? Question mark, because this is an area that floods, and it needs to be bubbled up to the Army Corps, and I think it needs to be discussed with them before you can go too far on this.
I won't speak to the particulars of the coordination with the Army Corps because we're not involved. I will say, I'm not sure if you were in the presentation, but we noted that taking a series of recommendations that development does occur and that understands that it needs to occur in relationship to the floodplain and making adjustments accordingly in terms of the development, such as recommended in New York City guidelines for development. So adjusting base elevation.
Well, that was my next question. Are you going to plan on building all of these buildings 2 feet over the BFE? Because from the pictures that
Yes.
I'm seeing, they are not proposed that way. It's
There's
going to
a-
change the visuals.
Okay.
But these are things that, before you go too far in this process, it needs to be coordinated, because $50+ million is going to be put into this community for flood mitigation, and this needs to be tied into that.
And I couldn't agree with you more, both as a member of the Flood Mitigation Advisory Committee, as former chair of that committee. Nobody understands that more than we do, and I think that in conjunction going forward, we absolutely, Peggy, have to make that in coordinating with the Flood Mitigation Committee, the village, and again, whatever else we have to do. Couldn't agree with you more. Ms. Nuringer.
Hi, I'm Clark Nuringer. This is obviously a very, very in-depth and intriguing study.
And I'm going to
commend
interject
you-
a second, because you were one of the former members of the first study that was.
That was then, this is now, and I just want to commend you for really getting into it, and it's clear you got very, very much in depth in terms of extracting historical data, information, and there are some fascinating things that you were able to discover on many different levels. As you know, Village of Mamaroneck, the manufacturing district, or the industrial district as we call it, was codified into law, into the zoning law via the 1968 zoning ordinance. And while there have been some minor tweaks since then, there's nothing really major that's occurred since 1968 with respect to zoning and the controls therein. And you brought out, one of the metrics you brought out, which is fascinating to me, is that in 1968 and to this date, there's apparently 700,000 square feet of FAR that's been left on the table. So I'm wondering, with the analysis and the work that you've done thus far, could you try and explain why that has not been developed to date by private property owners, and to the extent that one of the recommendations you have is to incentivize further development by increasing certain FAR up to 1.5, and that would presumably increase the 700,000 square feet to approximately 900,000 square feet. What do you foresee as the impetus that's going to get that square footage developed and intensify the use of the district? Thank you.
Thank you, Clark.
So, thank you. Excellent questions. You got quite a few there. So I'll start with the last one because it's fresh in my memory. What is the impetus that'll help bring about this vision of the future? I think we believe, and I hope that it could be shared with the village as a whole, that having a clear path to happen with an implementation plan that we're recommending, showing that the vision is supported holistically by the village, and also having the tools to express the potential of the place is the first step. So having that vision and crafting the tools and having the branding, I think is important, because there are things that if you don't know Mamaroneck, and if you don't know, even if you do know Mamaroneck, you may not know about this area. Celebrating those, pulling those forward, making those pivot points in the conversation that'll engage the development community, that engage various people who might be interested in bringing their businesses, and finding, as Eric said, catalytic anchor businesses to come early, whether it's a brewery or a large light manufacturer, so it makes props, or someone, these kind of early catalytic interventions will, if we find the right stew of them, will happen. And the second part of the study is, and we've already begun it, is a recruitment and retention thing to begin to pull those people and industries here to begin that catalytic thing. And I would strongly urge on this vision that you start doing some of the early short-term actions that begin to treat this as a different place. I think that in concert, those will make a big difference too.
I just want to interject a second, Clark. Again, the reason why I mentioned your prior historical context with industrial area committees is because you had that vision years ago. And the point is we want to expand on the foundations that you started. People like you in this community started, realizing the importance of taking the industrial area seriously and doing something with it in a productive manner. To answer one of your questions, why did we lose some of the structures that otherwise should have were either there or could be built? Several years ago, when 2008 hit, many people, on my belief, my understanding, panicked and said, okay, I'm not going to be able to get the tenancy. I'm not going to be able to get the occupants. Offers were given in terms of using the property for storage of cars, which to me, I think that our village deserves a lot better than that. Undoubtedly, this is a gorgeous, beautiful community. We deserve better than that. And I think some individuals, maybe it was under stress or panic. I don't know. But the fact is that was done, and what is here are the opportunities to rebirth, regrow, sort of like the phoenix out of the desert, and in a controlled manner. I think that can be achieved. But I think back in the marketplace in 2008, I think that was part of it.
Just a very, very quick follow-up question. Have you been able to determine within the area, the industrial area, what percentage of the property is privately owned as opposed to publicly owned?
We do have that. I don't know it off the top.
Okay.
We can certainly share that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is, just before the next question, there we've got in terms of the physical part of our implementation matrix, we talk a lot about zoning mechanisms and what could be done. I think personally, the 1.0 to 1.5, I don't think is completely necessary for the success of Waverly. First off, as a kind of disclaimer, it's a means of boosting property value and developer interest, which we've seen work. Even if there is a 9% office vacancy rate, it can happen. But I don't think it has to happen soon. Possibly not at all. But we talked a lot, and this addresses Peggy's question as well. We talked a lot about incentives to wet proof or dry proof in terms of flooding and what you get from that. So in New York City, for instance, you get more height if you dry proof, meaning if you sort of make a bathtub out of your basement and you don't let flooding happen at grade. If you do those things, which cost money to a private developer or property owner, if you do those things, you get a height bonus. There are other cities that actually give a bit of a bulk bonus, a density bonus. So that's the way we're looking at this, is that it's maybe not a complete rezone or retooling, but it's an incentive, it's incentivizing to take for private measures to be taken to protect property. so that we're not relying just on the U.S. Army Corps when they 40 years from now widen the Sheldrake, right? There's things we have to do right now that can be done on the public level and the private level, right? Okay.
Yes, sir.
I'm glad you mentioned your last comments about trying to create incentives. I think the plan is exciting, but I think it's just the beginning of strategic planning, and that's what we really need. But I think the strategic planning has to be more global. Washingtonville, but you have 3 other neighborhoods, actually 4 other neighborhoods that will be affected. And you have to think more globally in terms of what happens to them. And you can't just shift one problem to another or create another problem by doing that. But our zoning is basically stagnant zoning, i.e., you can build this way, and that way. Incentive zoning is a different approach. Actually, our local waterfront revitalization program is an incentive type of issue in terms of consistency with the policies. What we need is more incentive type zoning that's much more dynamic, that isn't build this, build that, build that. It has to also take into account the neighborhoods that surround it. So you can't just say, okay, we're going to do this and we'll worry about that later on the next study. I think you can name about 10 neighborhoods that have been waiting 40 years for the next study. And I don't think that's really the message. I don't think that's the message you're suggesting, but I think it's the message that we need to really incorporate in really a longer-term strategic vision. The other thing that I didn't hear is, what are you doing with a lot of the businesses that are in the industrial zone? They're both service businesses and we'll call it industrial, but they're light manufacturing. And they provide a very significant service to this community because you can't get those services in the surrounding communities around. So I didn't see anything in there of, do you want them? Do you not want them?
Of course,
what's the vision for that? So those are types of
they
things that have to be incorporated, because one of the things that they do add is they do employ people that are local, and they bring talent that is local. But what they don't do is bring a lot of traffic. So it seems to me that there needs to be more of a balancing effect of, types of businesses that you want to target, which I didn't hear about. I heard about a lot of the nightlife businesses, a lot of artistic things. I saw the, zoning in terms of high tech, which every community is looking for today. And so you can't, if the village wants to really do something that's meaningful, then it really, I think, and I like what you're trying to do, which is to think outside the box. It has to think how it is going to be different and how it capitalizes on our assets without the unintended consequences of, adverse effects to the neighboring, communities, particularly the residential communities that have been bearing the brunt of lack of, strategic planning.
Yeah, there are, just due to the constraints of time, we didn't touch on it, but there are serious recommendations. One of them is to really make a branding of the district and to promote things that are made, produced, and businesses that currently exist in there, and a way. So, for example, when we show the distillery district in Toronto, they have a whole website that shows you why to go there, what's the good things to find there, the businesses there, celebrates the business there, makes the connections for those businesses elsewhere in their region, and draws people to the existing businesses. And it's also that, and that kind of infrastructure is also a major recruitment and retention tool, because it shows that the local businesses are being supported. It'd be a good place for me to move my business in the future.
One of the other things that I'd like to just comment on, focusing on taking the river, which we presently have hidden, and making a focal point, which not only would help this area, but it also would help the surrounding neighborhoods on both sides of, on all sides of the area. But one of the things that you've thought about in terms of your post-conceptual zoning area was to move the automotive to the top right, which is surrounded on two sides by the river, and I'm not sure that that's, from an environmental vantage point, the most far-sighted approach, which makes it much more difficult to contain and much more flood-prone in that area. So I think we need to, in terms of strategic planning, we need to look at what our challenges are, as well as what our attributes are, and and how to incorporate them that is really meaningful. And I think those are the types of things that your plan is actually starting to get people to focus on, and I think that's to be commended, and I think it's very exciting, and I hope we carry it to the next level, and I think we need to carry it to the next level that really, when we look at the plan, the next time I see this slide, I expect to see a much wider view, i.e. what's happening in the other neighborhoods and how it integrates with this, because that's what we fail to do in terms of cause and effect, and we assume things will happen, but yet I don't think we really have thought them through.
Dan, thank you very much for the comments.
Great
Just
comments.
three things I just want to reply. One, I think at one of our very first meetings, we had a fine gentleman who came, conveyed the fact that they've had a family business here for generations and feared that our concepts and ideas would push them out. And I want to stress, again, as one of the forefronts and priorities, was to preserve those uses so that people aren't pushed out. Make it more inclusive. Rather than saying no, say, yes, let's see if this would work. And
But I think you need to include that in the presentation.
Absolutely.
Because those people who may or may not be here tonight, who have those businesses, would not get that impression from the overlay that you did tonight.
As we said, it provides good employment and products made in Mamaroneck. So it's something to be very proud of. In terms of the location, over here, these were all sort of ideas.
No, I understand, but what I'm trying to do is take that to the next level and think it through and say, okay, it's a great idea, and I understand why you might pick that, but then what's the consequence of doing it there versus maybe somewhere else?
In addition to the fact of to implement this concept so it doesn't sit idle, we all agree, and I'm glad that you share that sentiment because it's so important to take this to the next level. Factoring in the concerns raised by yourself and others here tonight, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was a lot of questions to follow up. My name is Michael Kislin. Two quick questions. So I'm new to this. I didn't realize how much fun this would be. So thanks for doing this and all this great effort. What's the
Thank you for having
process
fun.
of getting the variances approved? Is there like a vote, a public vote, or is it a public forum? That's question one. And then question two is, I think is there any leadership in the town here? Anyone raise their hand? Awesome. I think we missed the village. I think we missed a huge opportunity with maybe doing something at Hampshire Country Club, where we could have bought that and done some really amazing things for the community, where we could have got some more fields, more recreational spaces. I think the lowest hanging fruit is our recreational space. How can the town get involved in actually being the owner of that facility and getting some of the benefits of like the real economic development of like, income as opposed to just like maybe some kind of nominal tax rate? So that's it. Sorry.
I think
Great.
those.
Andrew, do you want to speak to the process?
Well, the process, taking a step back, I think that was one of the priorities of our committee as well, is how to make this so the system isn't archaic. For example, as I said several years ago, I said this 2 hours ago, a business, some individuals who wanted to invest in the community wanted to do an indoor type of soccer facility and in basketball. But because of the way that the zoning was set up, it made it very difficult. We had a presentation from several representatives from the city of Yonkers that were involved in the waterfront. And what they did is they took their original zoning policy, sort of changed it so you could come in that door and it's yes, let's see if we can make this work. Rather than the myriads of obstacles, make it seamless, make it welcoming to someone that wants to do that. We have to change the zoning. We have to. You cannot do retail anywhere other than that short little area along Fenimore Avenue. So I agree on that, and that's something that comes into what Dan actually said several minutes ago, was to implement this. From this point forward, we may not all have the answer in terms of where a location should be for auto body, but at least change the zoning so things can start happening, and stop sort of the gridlock in terms of the use.
Zoning changes, is that voted on? Just
That-
by a private board?
Not the private board, that, I'm going to defer to our, the, Bob. The Board of Trustees would actually.
And the planning board.
And the planning, there's a,
And then what about working with the town to build the facility?
well, that would be the village and town. This particular area is in the village, but falls in the town as well. You're paying taxes in both. And I think that's a unique approach, something that, quite frankly, I don't think we discussed. And I think in future meetings with the committee, many of the members who were here this evening, they haven't ran out yet. No, I'm just kidding. They're still here. But I think that's a very unique and innovative approach. Thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
here and for your comments.
I just want to thank everyone for their patience on a Mets game night and just taking your evening. 1-1.
That's tied.
1-1. So, but thank you once again, and we stay around afterwards if you have any other questions and you want us to answer. We'd be happy to.
And-
Points you want to add or thoughts.
If I could just conclude, this process is far from over. I again welcome comments from residents, business owners alike, the municipalities, and I guess I start the presentation with the word remiss. I would be remiss if I didn't thank, again, everyone for taking their time from their busy schedules tonight, from their families, to be here tonight. And also I have to thank LMC-TV. You've been standing here the whole time, and I thank you for a fantastic job. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We look forward to seeing you in the future.